This podcast is for teachers and educators that want to better understand what racial equity is, get strategies on how to create a culturally responsive learning environment, and learn how racial equity improves outcomes for students, particularly students of color.
So, good morning and welcome to the third recording in the R series brought to you by DEP Resource Teachers. Today's session is titled High Expectations for Low Performing Students, Strategies for Engaging Students Who Are Typically Marginalized and Muted. Hashtag, are you teaching or telling? My name is Taylor Utley and I'm here with the rest of the team.
I'm Rachel Klein. I'm the middle school resource teacher for DEP.
I'm Kenita Ballard. I am the RT for AIS Elementary Schools.
Donna Lawson High School.
Shashray McCormack, Zone 2.
And Katia Turner, Zone 1.
Culturally responsive teaching seems to be the new JCPS buzzword, but what does that really mean and what does it look like in the classroom? The Center for Collaborative Education defines culturally responsive teaching as committing to authentically building relationships with all students, ensuring that student perspectives and experiences are at the heart of teaching and learning, calling for teachers to reject assimilation, implicit bias, and default culture within the curriculum and in their relationships with students, particularly those from traditionally underrepresented groups, making sure that all students thrive within a cultural ecosystem that demands learning and that holds all students to the same high standards or competencies, while being cognizant that different students need different amounts and kinds of support to reach these common standards or competencies.
So as we talk about culturally relevant teaching, I know that the first thing that comes to some people's mind is, well, tell me what to do, or what does that look like? But I think it's very important that when you talk about culturally responsive teaching, you have to understand the socio-political lens that goes with it. And to better understand that a lot more, I would definitely suggest reading the book Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain by Zaretta Hammond. She does a good job of helping teachers to understand how culturally responsive teaching in the brain helps you to look from a socio-political lens.
One of the reasons that we as a team started using this definition is to help clarify for teachers what it means to be culturally responsive, and we really felt like this definition is complete. A lot of times when you hear about culturally responsive teaching, we think, well, that's just good teaching, and it is, but we need to understand what it means to just have good teaching. And so really getting to the part where teachers are able to understand what implicit bias is and to reject that in their classrooms is a very important part of culturally responsive teaching, as well as being able to build that thriving ecosystem within your classroom where we have appropriate scaffolds for all learners.
I agree, Katia. It's that ecosystem part that stands out to me. It's that living, changing entity that is interdependent, that it can't be prepackaged. You know, you have to know your students well enough to know what that looks like, and prepackaged can't happen.
And that just goes back to Shashray's earlier comment that you have to have the mindset first before you engage in this work and the strategies and the implementation of this work. Because when we are just looking at listicles that have this strategy and that strategy, and we try to implement them without understanding the context, we're not truly maximizing what we can do with these strategies and with our learners.
Speaking of what that looks like in the classroom, things to think about are, do all students see themselves depicted on the walls in your classroom? Think about the main characters in the literature and your other teaching resources. Are you bringing in trending topics and facilitating discussions with students? Do students have a voice in your classroom in rules and procedures, and are there choices provided in how they learn?
So thinking about our classroom walls and our environment that learners are walking into is a really critical point. And if you just look around your classroom today and ask yourself the question, where does each learner see themselves? If the only place where African American student sees themselves is in the colonial timeline as a slave, then think about the message that you're sending. If our Latinx students don't see themselves at all, think about the message that you're sending. And I know at elementary, we're really into bright colors and chevrons and polka dots.
And Pinterest.
And Pinterest.
And teacher pay teacher.
So thinking about how we can really use our walls to talk to our students and to send the message that we see them could make a shift towards being more culturally responsive.
Yes, Katia, I agree. I think it's important too that when you are looking at the walls, how about putting pictures of your students on the wall? It doesn't necessarily have to be pictures that you've bought. That because as we talk about pre-packaged, it's like, okay, I'm gonna check the box off. I've purchased images of kids from all over the world. So yeah, I got it. So, but why not actually have images of students, of your students on the walls, or them drawing pictures of themselves and you having multicultural crayons in order for them to depict themselves with, by looking at themselves in the mirror.
Yes, and I think on that note, one of the most important verbs when we're looking at this work through an equity lens is that verb of designing and design. We have to understand that we have to take the curriculum and the work and plug in what we know about our students and who our students are into the work, and that we just can't essentially have something prepackaged or purchased that necessarily will reflect our learners.
Back to design and how we create spaces that welcome our kids, I think we also need to be willing to leave some blank spots on our walls, and that's really challenging for people who want to create a safe, warm, welcoming visual environment. Back to Shashray's point, if we want our kids to feel welcome and visible and seen and included, then leave a space for them to eventually fill that with what they value. And that's an opportunity for them to communicate to you, whether through pictures or through language or through imagery, this is who I am and this is what I care about, and I do feel seen and valued in this space.
Okay, so one thing people might be thinking is, what does that have to do with high expectations? And when we talk about high expectations being culturally responsive, we need to re-envision that so that we're communicating high expectations in everything we do with our students. So when we welcome them into our classroom space and make them feel like they belong here, that's the first part of communicating high expectation, because we are giving them ownership in this classroom and letting them know that we expect them to have voice because they belong here.
And then digging deeper into expectations, sometimes we have the best of intentions, but we are communicating the wrong message to our students. Students are well aware of the expectations that their teacher has of them. Something as simple as your wait time when you're calling on certain students to answer questions can be indicative of your faith in their ability. A student expected to get the right answer might receive additional wait time or prompts and cues when struggling to find the answer. And on the other hand, sometimes we have a student that a teacher may have lower expectations of being cut off quickly when they hesitate to answer, or even scolded sometimes for not paying attention to the lesson. And we're all guilty of making mistakes. I think self-reflection is a vital part of teaching, because you may have classroom procedures and practices that are harmful to students without you realizing it.
Back to the idea of people trying to follow a curriculum or package products, purchase programs. I think there's a lot of pushback when we talk about culturally responsive teaching. Well, how can I fit this in if this is the progression of lessons that is recommended by this? And I think that we need to rely upon our strengths as teachers to be adaptable and to know our kids. And that all comes back to that relationship piece and knowing exactly what our kids need and when. But we can't excuse ourselves from not being culturally responsive in our practice by saying, well, I have to follow the progression, I have to follow this product. It is your job, it is your responsibility to look at that and say, what can I do to include the voices of our kids and to include their perspectives and to modify and make changes. Without changing the program, you're simply enhancing it. You're bringing in everybody's perspectives and you're modifying it for your kids, because ultimately that is our role, is to provide instruction that is tailored to the needs of our kids. And that ties straight back into what we expect from them in our spaces.
So, to Rachel's comment, speaking about teacher strengths and self-reflection, I think that we also have to be mindful of the intentionality that we need to invest into the work that we are doing with our learners, because ultimately we are accountable to our learners. We're not accountable to companies that produce these packages that have the label of being culturally responsive, yet these companies have never been with our kids, have never been to our schools. We are ultimately the experts on what our students need and who our students are, but we don't get to that level of expertise without investing time and energy and effort into understanding what is it that our kids need. And that time into understanding what our kids need can be supported with something like the R tool. And the R tool is located within the teacher's backpack and really supports that comprehensive lens of how do we bring cultural responsiveness into our cultures and climates.
Bringing it back to the R tool again, which stands for Affirming Racial Equity. I think that the reflective piece is very important. And our tool really does a good job of helping teachers to help students understand how bias and culture create and influence knowledge. So that too also brings in the socio-political lens that is important. And when I say that, I mean actually bringing in real world things that are happening into the classroom that kids are talking about outside of the classroom, and understanding the history of privilege and oppression that oftentimes teachers are scared to have conversations about, but I think is very important to do so. Of course, just recently there was a story of a young lady who was running track, but she wore a hijab, but she was disqualified because of her hijab. So bring that into the classroom and challenge policies, challenge procedures, have conversations about stereotypes and privileges and discrimination, and all of those things. I also wanted to bring up, there's a teacher right here in JCPS who used a book that, as we talk about high expectations, right, who used a book called 13 Ways of Looking at a Black Boy. And she used it as a way for poetry, as we talk about having to meet standards and all of these things that we have to do in our classroom. But she used it to talk about poetry and figurative language standards through a theme unit on justice. So the high expectation is that we're going to have some conversations about stereotypes and injustices, and I'm going to invite you to tell me, now that I've taught you what a stereotype is and what an injustice is, because you have to understand what injustice is in order to understand justice. So give me what you think are some stereotypes based off of what we're reading or what we're doing.
Shasharay, I love that you brought that up, because this is a perfect opportunity for us to highlight some engagement strategies already being used by JCPS teachers. So I know we all heard Candace Harden from Smyrna Elementary present recently on how she keeps conversation organic and student-centered in her 5th grade classroom with her talk moves. She kind of removes herself from the equation, because we can be very leading as teachers, and we want students to start thinking for themselves more. So at the beginning of the year, she teaches students these different nonverbal hand moves to communicate with one another. So if a student's answering a question, students can agree, they can ask for more detail, they can disagree, they can ask to expand on that. There's so many different conversation starters she has came up with that encourage fluid conversation within her classroom. I think we miss a lot of opportunities to engage students when we do too much of that. Ask a question, everybody raise their hand, call on one student at a time strategy.
I agree. I definitely agree, Taylor, because we discount inquiry a lot. We don't allow students to ask the questions, and we don't allow students to create curriculum. Thinking about a teacher, the teacher of the year, we had Nyree Clayton Taylor, her students begin to ask questions about reparations, understanding what that is. And instead of her discounting the questions they were asking about reparations, she used it as a way to build conversation and talk about the historical factors and why reparations is a conversation to be had. However, with her talking about that, she's gotten a lot of backlash and a lot of negative comments. But she also has a lot of positive that I would like to say, me included and the people at this table, with her kids have done a great job of having conversations with people that are pushing back on them, because she has done a great job of allowing them to have voice and to also use what they've learned in her class regarding having conversations about reparations. So you can sit them at a table and they can give you all the historical factors behind it and what they want to see happen.
So when you talk about high expectations and those power verbs from Bloom's, when you work with what the students want to know about, that's when they're able to persuade and argue and evaluate and synthesize and all of those things that we want them to do. And so, like Shashre was saying, high expectations is related to seeing that our students have backgrounds of value, that what they're interested in matters, and then to be able to link that to those skills and content that we're also asking them to learn about in the classroom.
I think one method or approach to extracting what kids want to know about, allowing multiple entry points into a conversation, is using Socratic circles or fish bowls. This is yet another opportunity where the teacher takes a back seat, and those kids are seated in a circle, and there's a protocol for asking questions and responding and presenting new topics for discussion. Talk about a way to watch a conversation flow organically. And you don't know what kids are into, sit them down in that circle, model it once or twice, and then back off and watch the depth of knowledge of both questioning and responses unfold before your very eyes, and talk about other means of giftedness. If we're trying to find out ways in which our kids are brimming with intelligence and your previous methods weren't extracting that before, this is one way to witness true leadership and watching certain kids rise up and guide conversations and bring in others into that circle. There's just so many ways to engage kids and bring it back full circle to those expectations for how kids demonstrate what they know, and in a multitude of ways.
And I just want to note at this time that of the examples that were given and the teachers that were referenced, going back to a comment that Donna made earlier, this is essentially an ecosystem of cultural responsiveness. And so when we try to piecemeal this work into, I'm going to do this strategy or I'm going to do 3 or 4 strategies, it doesn't work. When we bring these things all together into a system, that's then when we're able to really disrupt these systems by empowering our students. And again, a whole comprehensive culture and climate of cultural responsiveness. So we have to really look at not just the piece, but the whole machine, and looking at what we can do through an equitable lens when we're looking at the systems and instruction we're using in the classroom. And another thing I also want to note is that we oftentimes hear the comment of, when we're speaking to culturally responsive pedagogy, oh, well, isn't that best practices? And that is correct. Culturally responsiveness is not a other thing. It is the thing that we should be doing and should have been doing this whole time. And effectively, it's that powerful layer of understanding how the best practice, how the best strategy is making a meaningful experience for the individual learner, for the brown girl, for the ECE student, for the ELL student, for the Black boys. And again, understanding across the board how we're utilizing these expectations and these strategies to make a meaningful experience for all of our learners.
So these are just a few great examples of things happening in JCPS. We know there are a lot of amazing teachers out there in our district, and we would love to hear from you. So if you know a teacher who would be a good model for cultural responsive teaching, please contact Abdul Sharif for them to be featured in Envision Equity, Diversity, Equity, and Poverty Department's e-magazine.
And for all of our Twitter teachers out there, if you are seeing within your own classrooms examples that you want to highlight for the JCPS virtual community of examples of you using culture responsive strategies and expectations, you can snap a pic and hashtag it AREYOU JCPS.
As we're coming to a close and thinking about what it means to have high expectations and be culturally responsive, you could sum it up in 3 R's. How are you connecting relevance with your students? Does it mean anything to them? The level of rigor, are you giving them worksheets or are you giving them the opportunity for challenge? And most importantly, relationship. How do your students connect with you and how do you connect with them?
To wrap up for today, let's just say again how critical it is to set high expectations for all students. Students who are not performing at grade level need equal access to grade level curriculum with those appropriate scaffolds and accommodations to support their needs. They should be actively involved in setting goals for themselves and monitoring that academic progress. We've got to build academic confidence in our students. When they see those successes and you celebrate those successes, that's how you're going to build momentum. Cultural responsiveness in teaching is imperative. The more students feel like they are failing at school or not a part of the greater school community, the more difficult it is to re-engage them. And that concludes our podcast today on Are You Teaching or Are You Telling?